it by 3 lengths. Finishing second, Coach Smith said it's a photo for third.
Well, that's the way it sounded beneath the Twin Spires 40 years ago. Can you believe it? Mike Battaglia with the call of Swale winning the 1984 Kentucky Derby under jockey Laffit Pincay Jr. for owners Claiborne Farm and legendary trainer Woody Stevens. Today, the Pincay name remains synonymous with racing, not only because of one of the greatest jockeys ever to sit in a saddle, but also because of his son, Laffit Pincay III, who has made his mark as one of the leading horse racing broadcasters in our sport today. On October 30th, during Breeders' Cup Week at Del Mar, Lafitte is going to be honored with the Jim McKay Award for Broadcast Excellence, which is presented each year by the National Turf Writers and Broadcasters Association. And Lafitte is kind enough to spend a little time with us here this morning. Lafitte, congratulations on that well-deserved honor, my friend.
Thank you, Mike, so much. Too kind. Appreciate the very warm welcome. That call from Mike Battaglia in the '84 Derby never gets old. And congratulations to you as a finalist this year. This award, I know last year was my first time being on the ballot, and that's where that feels like the win. Anything being associated with the name McKay in this industry where broadcasting or television is concerned is the greatest of honors. So congratulations to you as well.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. When you hear the name Jim McKay, what thoughts come to mind, Lafitte?
Class personified. It's interesting how you observe somebody and look up to somebody, admire somebody from a distance, as I did as a kid, and I don't really think I understood why. I would be interested in what Jim McKay was saying on television, but I would associate it with something important and be drawn to a certain storyline and just admired his work. And then years later, very early on in my career, you get to meet that person. And that person is everything you hope they would be and more. Because sometimes you meet somebody you admire from a distance, and then maybe you're a little disappointed. Maybe they're not quite not quite who you thought they might be, and that can be a real letdown. He was as classy, as humble, as gracious. As far as I interviewed him, and I was shaking. This was at the Maryland Million a couple of years before he passed, 05, 06, and I was shaking because here's, you want to do a good job. And this is, I'd only been in television for, a couple of years at that point. And he took all the time and had I remember him saying, I've watched your work. You do a good job. I mean, he was probably making it up, but that's not the point. What that meant to me early on in my career, to hear that from, wow, Jim McKay has actually, seen my work. And he was a big fan of my father's. He that Derby call you just heard, Jim interviewed my father shortly thereafter. My dad thought the world of him. Won a Maryland Million race for Jim on a horse named after his son, Sean's Ferrari. And then now, all these years later, when I first learned that I was associated or a finalist for this particular achievement for this award, just the name alone, how everything coming full circle, and somebody who first really inspired me as a kid to be associated with anything with his name, it meant the world.
Yeah, and congratulations, too, to our broadcasting brethren, Todd Schrupp, who was also a finalist for this award this year, and very, very well-deserving in his own right. And, when you talk about interviewing Jim McKay, and you said you were shaking, Lafitte, I believe that is the most difficult thing to do in broadcasting, to interview another highly accomplished broadcaster that you have watched over the years and maybe even idolized in some respects. That, to me, is more difficult than any other interview that you were going to do as a broadcaster. I don't know if you agree or not.
1,000%.
Yeah.
You start playing a little bit of defense. You're just like, don't screw up. Don't take any chance. Let's just play this safe.
Yes.
Because they know the difference between you can sense someone's anxiety. You can sense someone how nervous they are. And you don't want to come off like an amateur in front of an idol. I remember when I was rehearsing for this was at NBC at the Preakness, one of the first Preaknesses I worked, and we were rehearsing for the undercard show, and right before the big show started, and I'm like 10 feet from Bob Costas. I'm like, really? I can see him out of my peripheral, and I actually said to him, Bob and I at a horse racing event, all we do is talk baseball, and I'm like, you can't stand there. You can't do this to me, man. It puts you you're in a situation there that somebody who you think is of the very best at what they ever did, and you want to, it's not about impressing somebody, but I guess there's such a mutual respect there that they understand that you respect the art enough, that you put in the time, that you were prepared, that, yeah, maybe you do have a hint of ability, but you sure as hell don't want to choke right in front of somebody you think so highly of and leave that as their lasting impression.
Yeah, very much so. Let's go back to the beginning here a little bit, Lafitte, and talk about what led you to this career in broadcasting. You grew up in Southern California, the son of one of the greatest jockeys of all time, and you were kind of like many other kids. You wanted to be an athlete. You didn't ever plan on being a jockey, because I've read many stories and conversations that you've had with people where you said, I was always going to be too big. But there was an opportunity for you to be an athlete. Didn't quite pan out. You were pretty good, though.
I pitched for years. I was a good, hard-throwing, left-handed pitcher with a lot of natural movement on pretty much everything I threw. I didn't have to. I had a decent changeup. My curveball on any given day, I just didn't know where it was going. Control was always an issue, but I threw hard with a lot of natural movement. And look, I was never under the impression that, there isn't a lot of, call in the majors for like a 5'8" left-handed pitcher whose fastball tops out in the low 80s. This is in high school,
Right.
And so even though I always knew I wanted to be associated with sports in some capacity. And so when, you're not going to, even if I was 4 or 5, Dad wouldn't have let me ride because of how truly difficult the life of a jockey is and the sacrifice. And even when you're doing so well and at the top, the idea that you're having to starve yourself, the idea that that's a completely different conversation. As dangerous as it is, I don't think he would have allowed it, even if we wanted it, even if that was a possibility. But what I did decide was, somebody suggested after high school, what are you thinking about doing? What are you interested in? And I had just in the last couple of years taken interest in my father's career and dug up all of his old VHS tapes. When I got done watching all of those races, I found his treasure trove of beta tapes and had those transferred to VHS. This is the early 90s.
Yeah.
And after watching all of it, I found how tuned in I was to, depending on the broadcast, how much of a difference it made the outcome of the race to the viewer. Because to me, these races, I'm seeing them for the first time, even though they're 20 years old, 10 years old. And when I got to all of the NBC Breeders' Cup races, I watched them over and over and over again. And I just said, I was like, that's it. That's what I want to do. I want, whether it's, and it wasn't necessarily horse racing. Listen, I wanted mainstream. I was a huge football fan, big baseball fan, obviously, basketball. Horse racing wasn't like, okay, that's it. But the way these sport, the way the event is covered makes a difference in how you feel about the outcome. And I think that's, something I just stumbled onto. And that was probably when I decided, that's what I want to explore.
What was your first job in broadcasting?
Oh, wow. I was the press box steward at Hollywood Park for Mike Mooney. Hired me a Yule Wide as well back in 96, 97. And I did that where I would print past performances and get the media guides together for all of the journalists coming in, covering the bigger races that that weekend. I was kind of in charge of making sure they had everything they needed in order to write and cover their stories.
I read an article as I was preparing to have this conversation with you, and I believe it was in Daily Racing Form, and I think it was about 10 years ago, and it talked about one of your first jobs in New York, and your dad was a bit concerned because it was a bit of a dangerous neighborhood, if you will, that you were working in. Tell me about that.
My first on-air job was at News 12 in the Bronx, and we're not talking like by Fordham. We're not talking like Riverdale. I mean, we're talking about the boogie down, right? And in an area where just, look, there's a lot of news happening. There's a lot of stuff going on. They wanted young, cheap, inexpensive, inexperienced on-air personnel that would like do everything. Like aside from like mopping up, it was a one-man band. You ran around with a tripod. You would set up the tripod. You would shoot everything yourself. You would have to. I'm not going to take you through the long, drawn-out process of trying to set up a stand-up with one person, no cameraman. Your own segment producer, your own editor. You did everything on your own. But to get a job on air in what was considered the number one market, that's still New York City, right? Yeah. And covering, instead of the Yankees, I'm covering like Christ the King Pee Wee football, right? Everything, all of the smaller stuff. But it didn't matter. It was fine. It was getting reps. And I was probably 21. And not only the reps that I got in front of a camera, even if it was all on tape and you could, there was never any real pressure as far as doing anything live. Getting to know and understand what happens behind the scenes, because of we were the behind the scenes as well, allowed me to appreciate everything that goes into what making a good product is in television from the other side of the camera, and understanding and respecting how big of a part of the finished product that actually is.
Yeah, that was Jay Hovde, by the way, who wrote that article about you 10 years ago in the Daily Racing Form. It was a really cool read to go back and kind of flip through some of those stories in there. What led you then back to horse racing and becoming a horse racing broadcaster?
And on needing a job. I actually lost that job because I came out to California and stayed in California while my dad was trying to break Bill Shoemaker's all-time win record. It's not something that you know when it's going to happen, and eventually it's going to happen. Some static with my boss and I before that kind of led to that unfolding the way it did. And I'm not like the tragedy would have been had I left and not been there. I wanted to be there to support my father and my family. And when I returned to New York shortly thereafter, there's the door. And so while I left with a tape and I was able to, an agent signed me, a good agent, looking and trying to get on-air work with limited reps, it was difficult. So it was really more a matter of just needing a job. And it was Amy Zimmerman who hired me at Santa Anita in March of 2003 with the idea that there was a new racing channel that was about to be launched covering the Stronach tracks or whatever we were calling it at the time. And I went in for an interview and Amy hired me. I told her I needed to kind of get a grasp of what they wanted from an on-camera presence. And I didn't know that I was ready for that in racing. So she actually let me produce for 6 months to kind of get a better feel. And then at that Oak Tree meet, I started with my, getting a few reps in front of the camera because I focused on mainstream sports, and it was kind of just learning as we went. And getting all those reps before social media, given the option to like suck without anybody watching, was massive. And that's how that's essentially that was the start of it.
Talking with Laffit Pincay III here on HRRN. Laffit, earlier we discussed the time that you had the opportunity to sit down and visit and interview Jim McKay and what that was like. You had a tradition when you were working with HRTV of interviewing your dad every year on his birthday, December 29th. Tell me a little bit more about that and how special that must have been.
That goes back to the conversation we had about not wanting to, there's another one, an interview you don't want to screw up, right? But our relationship is such that we've just become closer friends as we've both gotten older. And I know that the viewers, that was something they really enjoyed. It was something that he would by the third, fourth year, he would remind me, hey, my birthday, are we going to do this? Yeah, of course. And I got to a point where, the first time I ever interviewed him, it was after he won the Monrovia. In 2003, New Year's Eve, I believe, Little Sister Stitch, I think her name was. I'm calling him Lafitte, right? Because obviously at that point, I'm probably, I don't know, some sort of subconscious insecurity about, the obvious, reek of like nepotism there, which, as I've often said, nepotism gets a bad rap. And I remember how nervous I was interviewing him in the winner's circle. That's the only time I've ever rooted against my father. It was the first winner's circle interview I'd ever done. Huge field. She's not a favorite, like anybody but her. And naturally, he wins, and there we go. So at first, those moments I remember being really nervous because I don't, you want to impress Dad. And and as we did it, year after year, it became something I really looked forward to and, treasure the fact that I have that, I can watch that whenever I want. And as much as I know the viewers enjoyed it, it was something he and I really like doing every year as well.
I'm sure that's going to be a memory that you'll cherish forever, Lafitte. But let's talk about some of the other more memorable moments you've had the privilege to be part of as a broadcaster on the horse racing side of things. What are some of the memories that stand out to you when you think back on your career?
Wow. The first Kentucky Derby I ever covered as with NBC. That was, I remember when we started the reporter whip around, and it went from, the beginning of the broadcast, and when they went to the reporters, it was Bob Newmeyer, and then Kenny Rice, and then myself, and Bob and Kenny, and this was the year, I believe I'll have another one. I was so nervous, and their voice, they had this calming presence about them that, you're just telling a story. And while I couldn't make it sound as easy or as fluid as they could, certainly, that kind of, I could take a deep breath after hearing their voice. So being there and realizing this is, because in this industry, naturally, that's the event you really want to be a part of, and to be part of a broadcast at the highest level covering the biggest sport. That is the goal. That's certainly one that comes to mind. Interviewing winning connections in the infield at Churchill Downs, having a chance that for the first time that was Mario and Doug, and I think the following year with Shug and Joel with Orr. Certainly those are moments that come to mind, and being in the winner's circle after Justify won the Triple Crown. I was there for American Pharoah, but just if you're asking of moments that really have kind of stuck, speaking with Bob Baffert and Mike Smith after Justify won a Triple Crown, and certainly those are some of the moments that really do stick out.
Yeah, those are special moments. And listening to you talk about your first Kentucky Derby telecast, I was thinking back to our first one in 2011 when we were standing there and we're getting ready to come on the air, and I'm getting ready to open the show on national radio for the very first time for the Kentucky Derby. And I had many of those same emotions and butterflies, and I might even had a few tears in my eyes as I was getting ready to do that. You got to kind of block all that out, right? But it's difficult to do in those types of moments.
At the end of the day, and that was, so I hosted the undercard show for Versus before it became NBCSN. Mm-hmm. It went from Outdoor Network to Versus to NBCSN. Your first Derby was my first Derby, working on the undercard. I didn't work on the big show, on the big NBC show, till the following year. But yeah, Animal Kingdom was my first. And I remember, I think there's more emotion when you get the call that, the Yankees just called and want you to play center field. My God. That moment I'll never forget. I had to pull over because that's difficult to put into words what that meant. And then walking into Churchill, not as a fan, not the son of a jockey, but as part of the broadcast team, that brings about a certain emotion. If it all goes well in the end, that brings about more emotion. But I think in the moment right before, for me, when I start, whether it's anxiety or nerves or focus, you have to block that stuff out and try to find a place where you're just centered and in the moment and breathing, and then you can just do your thing. Otherwise, those are moments that, as I don't have to tell you that your ability to communicate will become impacted because of what anxiety and nerves. You don't want to choke, and you have to, that's, learning how to compartmentalize, being in the moment and remembering, I want to be here. It's not, I'm afraid of this. There's certain, if you don't want the ball in the last 2 minutes, then you don't want the ball in the last 2 minutes and give it up. Give it to somebody else. Maybe they'll, hit the big shot. And you want to be the guy that wants the ball when it matters most. It's not always easy to find that place emotionally, mentally. It can be elusive, but that's what you want in that moment.
Okay, with that being said, Lafitte, tell me about your approach and your philosophy when it comes to presenting horse racing on television.
It's a concept of being familiar with the material that is going to resonate with the viewer most, that doesn't follow horse racing on a day-to-day basis. The bigger the show, the more novice the viewer. Give them a reason to care. In a Travers that is always a big race and always matters and always has championship implications. No, this is different. This is something that if you can't spell horse racing, you're going to want to see. It goes, the girl competing with the boys. I remember it's one of my favorite lines in racing in a broadcast ever when Donna Brothers picked Rachel Alexandra to win the Preakness because, quote, because she runs like a girl. Like, it just stuck. And that's, anybody can relate to this story. If you don't watch horse racing, you see her, she's faster than the boys that are supposed to be better than her. Like, this hasn't happened since, the dark ages. And now you have them. Now you've latched your hooks into the viewer, and they're going to stick around, whether it's 3 hours or however long it is, to tune in and watch that race. And you want to be in a place where you can just comfortably deliver that message as simple as possible. And again, in those moments, I think we all have our, little sort of whatever your pregame ritual might be to get you in the best possible place, which obviously starts with, get a full night's sleep, because that's really easy to do when your anxiety's really going.
Right.
All of that has to be navigated so that you're in the best place. And again, it can be elusive. Sometimes game day is there and maybe you don't have your best. Maybe you're not as sharp as you'd like to be. Maybe you're not as focused as you'd like to be. And you have to kind of figure it out on the fly. But finding that sweet spot of just being still energetic while controlled and breathing, being everything is kind of, that's where you want to be.
Lafitte, you've done it for a long time, and you've done it as well as anybody, my friend. And I'm going to end this conversation by congratulating you once again on that Jim McKay Award for Broadcast Excellence. Perfect name for somebody like yourself, because you've done it at a high level for a long time. And, man, I appreciate it. Thanks for the conversation here this morning, and well done, my friend.
Much appreciated, Mike. Thank you, and thank you for having me on.